live. Welcome to the Best in Cloud podcast, a Warcraft podcast by the community for the community. I'm your main host, Sparty, and I'm here with my co-host, Midgettes. This is episode 16. Today we'll be talking about really the intolerance of new people, noobs, which we did talk a little bit on our Facebook and our Twitter, toxicity in the community, a little bit about alpha, and hopefully next week we will have the wonderful Zupercat from Mr. Robot coming to join us here to talk more about toxicity and everything else in the community. But hello, Midgets, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Sparty. How are you?
I am fantastic. This seems like we've done it before, many times, or just 10 minutes ago.
Groundhog Day. Wasn't Groundhog Day not long ago?
That's right. I don't know if we have more winter or what's coming, but really, we do know one new thing that's coming in the community, right? One brand new thing?
Well, I've heard now, and it's sort of a rumor, but I think there was some initial alpha invite-only BattleNet access that was granted this week, but I could be wrong on that.
I see. So you may or may not have access, huh? Well, yes, alpha is out for those of you that haven't or have been hiding under a rock the entire time. It has been invite-only alpha, which is we sort of knew what was coming. We mentioned it in previous streams where alpha's coming, potentially, maybe there might be keys. If you want keys, go ask Midgets. No, there's no keys. Don't ask Midgets.
Do not ask Midgets. I think we should pick somebody else. Who are we going to pick? How about Severus? He's the one that has all of those jokes. I think we should pick him.
He's a good guy. He's my favorite boomkin, and he has some good jokes, so I do like them. Let's blame Sev. Severus, Stormrage US. Whisper him for keys. Not sure what the keys will be for, but he might send you some kind of keys. Thorium keys, iron keys for opening lockboxes. But yes, let's move on. There's spoilers obviously on Twitter. Things are getting going. In this initial alpha release, there's a couple dungeons. There's some new races, that kind of stuff. Very similar stuff to what we've seen already in the BlizzCon demo, but with a little bit more substance to it. So it's good. I mean, it's not a ton of things, but it's a good little start there to the process. We know that it's coming, right? Alpha, beta, more waves are coming. More people will be given access. Don't fret if you don't have access yet. It is coming.
Well, and the big thing about it is, I know I sort of just turned off my Twitter because I haven't gotten access yet, and I like to go in and experience for the first time for myself. So what are we going to do on our Twitters and everything else when you open up social media and everything you see is a spoiler alert? Because even in the announcements, and a lot of places, there's some that I've contemplated unfollowing because they have no way for me to filter them out if I don't want to see it. So what are we going to do? Yeah,
it's like one of those things where you don't want to see things, like you want to leave some of those media channels alone. And you don't want those clickbait articles of, see how Anduin dies in Battle for Azeroth, but it's in the title. You've just spoiled it for me. Thank you, Sparty. You don't want to let people know that kind of stuff, right? They need to do a better job with those non-clickbait articles, whether it's Wowhead or whatever else, to not spoil it for people so they don't have to, mute the entire section. I want to hear Wowhead news in my little thing, but not hear how Anduin dies in the end of Battle for Azeroth.
Right. Well, and I know one of our leaders came to us and asked us if we could create a separate channel for BFA discussion. So we did.
Yeah.
There are people who don't they want to experience it for themselves when they get in there. They don't want to know any of this.
I think it's a great thing to do. I encourage people these days to don't spoil it for yourself. Experience it live for the first time. You're going to enjoy it that much more. Really, it's great. It's a great way to build hype right now for the game, as well as allied races. But it's also a good time to give feedback, right? Like, this is the time where if you're going to be invited to the alpha, really, you're there to, number one, promote the game, number two, give feedback, right? Your feedback does matter, and it should be constructive of, well, why don't you like this dungeon? Why don't you like this boss, right? Not, this dungeon sucks, this allied race sucks, Void Elves are awesome. And things like the allied race abilities, which we already have now, right? Now's the time to give feedback on some of these things, too, as we get into them.
Well, and I know Warcraft devs said on their Twitter that they are listening to the comments, especially about the racials. Now, have you gone in and done any beta yet or alpha yet?
No, not since the initial two dungeons that I've done. Haven't really done any beta. I mean, yes and no. As much as I want to capitalize on the alpha hype, I'd like to do longer streams where we can do a little bit more with the viewers, potentially some dungeons, raids, that kind of stuff, as it opens up to a little bit more people. So you'll probably see me playing some alpha in the short future.
Well, I know I'm looking forward to it, and we're going to eventually evolve best in slot to having a different segment for the alpha and the beta to separate it for our viewers.
For sure.
But I think we go, we're going to jump into something a little bit different. Everybody else is talking about alpha. We like to be different. What are we going to talk about?
Well, I mean, we could talk about alpha, but really, it's something that's been in the community for a while, and I want to have a lot of substance to this podcast, not just a lot of fluff. Really, I want to talk about a lot of the toxicity that is pervasive in the community, right? And what is this bandwagon bitching? What is the toxicity that we want to talk about exactly, right? Is it just a new phrase that is really overused by players of, oh, you're being toxic, oh, you're being mean, oh, you're being a bully? But what does it mean? What does it mean to you?
Well, I think it's almost becoming a catchphrase. And I think we don't spend enough time, honestly, on looking at maybe what we could be doing better. So much of the stuff I see, it says Joe is doing this wrong, and Joe is the one that's in this channel or in this raid or in this thing, and he's doing these things wrong. And so much of it is, I think all of us need to look at, but it's not just being mean. Some of it is awful.
Oh, I completely agree with you. And yeah, we probably do it ourselves. And, who's to blame for the toxicity? Is it the game? Is it, LFRs? Is it looking for a dungeon thing? The quick queues? Yeah, it's all a part of it, sure, a small part, but really who's to blame for all of this? I think it's us, right? It's us as a community for allowing a lot of these things and condoning for these things to happen over such a long time. And it's gotten to this point where, the Ask Mr. Robot made a huge Discord essay on toxicity there, and there's tweets going on all the time now of other streamers being harassed for toxicity and all this stuff going on. And yeah, I think partly we're part of the problem. We're overvaluing things like percentiles in Warcraft logs, right? Or Raider IO score, or meters, or loot, or whatever. And yeah, to an extent, that was there back in vanilla when you had purple gear, but now if your DPS is in so-and-so, or your rankings are on so-and-so, well, then people are going to be toxic towards you. And that elitist attitude is much more prevalent now than it was before, I would say.
Well, I didn't know. I thought I needed a 970 eye level and a 2400 at least Raider IO score before I could do Emerald Nightmare normal.
That's the thing, right? I mean, we can exaggerate that kind of stuff, but that's the point where it gets sometimes where, normal and Taurus is tuned and designed around a 915 item level, but players want a 930, 945 because they want a super smooth experience, whatever, right? And yeah, I get part of it is we're living in the age of convenience and the age of instant gratification, and we want things done super quick, right? But that patience is long gone from players, and people aren't willing to work with each other, right? You're a dirty casual or you're elite raider. I work harder than you. I have more time. I have responsibilities. The arguments always go back and forth, right? But really, it's all about us as a collective community dealing with this toxicity, right? I mean, people, I've played both ends of it. I did high-end PvP in Season 1. I did, high-end mythic raiding for such a long time, and now I've been doing a lot of the community building stuff, and I've seen all sides of it. And people need to recognize that it's not that I am better than you, it's I have different skills than you, right? And it's not some kind of sissy way of saying that, but I have different things that I'm better at, right? Or I have different things that I'm passionate about. And just because I am not a raider or a top 5, US or really top 5 US, sorry, top 5 EU world raider doesn't make me a lesser player, right? Because I like doing pet battles, or I like doing PvP stuff, or I like doing things like Guild Survivor and community events, right? That's what I'm really passionate about these days. So it's a little bit of everything, right? And that lack of patience for LFR, and yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's a bit of everything, right?
Well, it is. And I remember, some of these conversations for me came up when we were talking about some of our favorite loot upgrades in Titan Forge.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the comments came back, I work harder in the game than you. And I thought, no, I just spent 4 hours crafting for you guys. I don't want to hear about it.
Mm-hmm. Right, and what is working harder technically, right? What is spending more time doing things, right? Who says what is more effort?
Right. Well, and it's interesting though. So we have to take a look at that at a level of individuals as individuals, of perhaps we contribute to some of the segregation or the differences with just something. This was somebody I really liked and respected. And he came back and said, well, I work harder than you. You shouldn't get this loot. Oh, come on. Leave me alone. And I think if we work on it at those levels, we help this thing. But there's toxicity in the community, which, again, I sort of think this is almost becoming a catchphrase,
Mm-hmm.
is so many different segments. And when we were talking about putting this podcast together, it was like, there's like 5 topics here. So we want to save some because we really do want Supercat to come and we want to take her article and talk about some of it. But I think there's other things that we can look at. Do we have unrealistic expectations? Are we a little bit more aggressive in LFR? Or we go in, we're busy, we want to get it done. We have this tank that comes in and he's not in tank spec and he can't keep aggro and we're wiping. And Coven's a lot of fun. Coven's my favorite fight in LFR, just so you know.
Oh, I can imagine. Well, with fights like, Coven and a lot of those things, yeah, part of it is LFR and the lack of patience. I recall, back in my early days of streaming, the people would come in, this guy's so toxic, he's so mean. And there's a difference of, keeping raiders accountable and holding their feet to the fire, as you often so say, to using really degrading language of, you're terrible, you suck at this game, you shouldn't even be breathing, go kill yourself. Like, that's super degrading language that doesn't belong anywhere, right? That's toxicity that we're talking about. Not get out there and go score some friggin' goals and, let's play better, turn awesome to 11, turn down the suck, let's go get a kill, right? Like, that's different. And people aren't used to that kind of, I don't know, I'm going to say team sport John Tortorella style, right? That's part of it. And, you look at things like streaming, right? I know we're all guilty of those moments, right? Those streaming moments. And here, I'll use an example that a friend said, you're doing a raid on normal or heroic, and the trash just before Veramathras, that stupid fire guy that spreads the fire cooties everywhere, and you're standing still, and I was doing this yesterday too, when one of my darling viewer raiders was guilty of this too, and I'm standing there, not moving, and there he goes, running on top of me with a fire debuff, and we both die. And it's one of those moments where you're just shouting expletives, you're not streaming, right? But it's those moments where, oh shit, I was caught for doing something like that, right? And those are the kind of moments that a lot of streamers have as well, that, we forget we're shooting for a second, and those are the emotions that are often raw and live, right?
Well, I can tell you one thing's for certain. It's a good thing I don't stream because I swear every time I'm at that trash, I get killed twice because they take my cloak and then I come back up and somebody else with cooties comes back and kills me again. And the other night, the cat left the room. So there's a reason I don't stream.
A lot of your teammates do listen to the podcast and, and now they're taking notes for later. Hopefully good notes and not bad notes for when you're doing that.
Oh, no, they started this with a joke. I mean, they chased me around and tried to kill me, but now everybody kills me. It's just, it's a given. I know I'm going to die. I'm no longer going to zone in for that trash, just so you know.
Okay, well, just wait outside. That's what, I think Roshi and some of the other guys do. They just wait outside doing loot until the trash is done so they don't have to deal with, that kind of stuff.
With the cooties in the raid, that's okay. I got you on Coven, if I remember correctly. That was a lot of fun. I did enjoy that. It's much more fun to kill you than to be killed, just so you know.
Yeah, I know. Triple life grip and all. There's always new ways to kill Sparty. So back to this toxicity, right? I mean, and you talked about a little bit about unrealistic expectations, right? Let's talk about the gnome community. You are a gnome. Let's talk about your brothers and sisters of the knee height. Um, the gnome community was up
You're
in
gonna
arms.
make friends by calling them that, you know.
The gnome community was up in arms because there was not a gnome featured in one of the splash screens of the Alliance and Goblins. Same thing for the Horde side. It was, I mean, not even a panda was featured. It's got a couple of the races, 2 humans, right? And yeah, to an extent, they have a point, right? And my retort to the whole thing was, look at the camera angle of taking the picture, right? It's clearly a gnome or a goblin taking a picture because it's from down low to up high. And obviously, gnomes and goblins are the smartest races, and they're the only ones that can operate a camera. Everyone else is too dumb. But realistically, they they have some complaints about the lore and not being included, and they want to feel valued and included. And truthfully, those races have not been a part of major lore. I'm sorry to say that, but you haven't been a part of major lore, and Blizzard, yes, has heard them, right? But Blizzard doesn't necessarily agree, or the artist doesn't necessarily agree, or it would have thrown off the sizing. One argument I saw on Twitter was it would have thrown off the perspective if it was all these tall people and then a super, super small gnome right next to them. I don't know. I mean, yes, it's there.
Well, welcome to my world in Raid, because I'm surrounded by tall people.
Regular sized people. We're regular sized people.
No, you're all giants. Well, and there's a good way to do it, and there's a constructive way to do it, and it happens every X-Pack, especially
Okay.
or major.
So how
patch.
do I give feedback that is constructive and not toxic as a gnome complaining about this issue?
Okay, well, probably F the F off is probably not constructive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just so you know, and that was one of the big ones that went out. Putting a post on the forums or tweeting and saying we'd really like to be that, I don't know. I don't know that they're ever going to get the right answer, because I don't think gnomes and goblins and some of the other races, because there's a lot of races that are not in those pictures.
Yep.
It's probably not that storyline. I think they've been heard. I think they hear it. I just don't think that that's the direction they're going. And so every X-Pack they go, and some of the comments are very, very good and very constructive. And then we have the one, my favorite, this X-Pack was, at Warcraft devs, you can F the F off. And they didn't say the full word, but the sentiment was still there, and the salt was there. And it's a perfect example of how even something as little as that can build the toxicity.
Yeah, no, I agree, right? And that sort of moves us to the next little thing here. And I'm going to link that in chat for you guys. It's from our notes from our podcast. But there's a number of just threads that we saw, and this is, an ongoing issue there, where don't blame the players, blame the game. It is the game's fault, right? It is less accountability with LFRs. It is server transfers. It used to be that people would have reputations, and now there's no reputations being held. It's all turned into a big sissy game. That was number one. It's not the player's fault, it's the game's fault. You let us turn into this, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think it's always a community issue. It's not necessarily, Blizzard to facilitate these evil ways of anti-community-ish, but it's us in general. Another thread was there about toxicity, and that one was sort of okay. The third one was more about toxic people, the rant, and that was more of a better one, where it's about us. Next, the guy was sharing a story about how he was doing LFR or PvP or something, and the first words coming out of one player in a random battleground were all this toxic, like these just toxic comments, right? And the same kind of toxic comments that you would see, in competitive Overwatch or Heroes matches or whatever. And like, these are the first words you're saying, the first impression you're making to a new player, and that's the words you choose. Probably not the best thing to do, right? And well, what do we do? What do we do in those situations, right? So, you're an LFR hero. You're going into an LFR now, and you see that toxicity, right? So, what do you do? What do you do, Midgettes?
The thing. Well, sometimes I just don't say anything at all. And the last time I was in LFR, I had this guy come in, and he was yelling at everybody about how they were horrible and they were wasting his time, and how they, you know, if they would only come prepared, it wouldn't be such a thing. On a side note, he was dead for half of the three bosses.
So he had a lot of time to comment.
Yeah, he had a lot of time to comment. So at the end, because generally I don't generally say anything. I sort of just go through my LFR and try to be helpful and answer questions and set an example. And at the end of this fight, I whispered him and I said, you know, the people that are new that are coming in, they aren't the problem. It's people like you that are sort of the problem. And he told me I could go off myself. And that was his response. He said, we one-shotted all of the bosses. And I was really tempted to come back and say, who's we? You were dead. But that would have just contributed to it.
Let me stop you there. So, number one, so you're the kind of player that will typically, you know, help out the new players. You know, some guy is trash talking, he's dead the entire time. And there's sort of 2 or 3 ways to go around in that situation. Number one is sort of what you did, is just disregard what he's saying, deal with the positive people. The other really common one that you get from a lot of, you know, from a lot of players is, well, you're dead, you suck, blah, blah, blah. And you're continuing that kind of dialogue, right? It's just going back and forth and back and forth. And then there's what you said at the end there, where like, hey, this isn't contributing, this is not okay. See, where I would have gone one step further is, in that raid chat said, hey, this is not okay. And people will chime in or they won't chime in. And that at that point, you know, you need to teach them a lesson and just vote to kick. Vote to kick for really toxic, you know, very toxic things, and you know, get them out of the way, right? So it's yeah, communicate, it's say what you need to, but take it one step further, right? Because we are responsible for that entire community.
Well, and we are. And the problem with that is, and this is where we can come into, you know, what we call the bandwagon bitching. Once you start that conversation and having those kinds of things happen, Evelyn doesn't like the toxicity in the community.
No, clearly my little one doesn't.
Clearly she is very upset about LFR. But so we've got these things of, once you say something, then it becomes a free-for-all, and you have the 2 sides, and it becomes a bigger fight, because I've watched it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And people do eventually get kicked, but some of them you go in and there's great people and they may not know and you can help them, and then others, they're just fighting because we wiped or whatever. And it's sort of up in the air as to which way it's going to go. So I don't generally go that far, because number one, I want to set an example and not be contributing to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that often it turns into a free-for-all.
I agree. And Romoli's here in chat makes a really good point, where is it toxic for calling out people for AFKing, not contributing to, and not knowing mechanics? Okay, so break that down in a couple things where, hey, they're AFKing, so are you going to say, hey, you're a little shit, stop being AFK? Or, hey, know the mechanics, go learn to play, right? Part of that is how you phrase it and the tone of those messages, right? It's, are you contributing to the environment? Are you contributing to people being AFK with no recourse? Or are you going to be there to help educate those guys of, hey, man, you know, we're not really getting anywhere with you being AFK. That being said, you don't know why they went AFK. Their house could be on fire. Their cat could be on fire. Their goldfish might be drowning, right? And you don't know, right? So don't rush to those judgments. And if you have a brand new player that is brand new to Warcraft, listen, they may not know about Dungeon Journal or, you know, DBM or boss mods or that kind of stuff, right? You see some really good LFR leaders out there that are explaining those things for players, right? They're leading by example, and maybe that's what you should be doing as well.
Well, and I think that's where it is. And all of this starts with us. And you have to think about who you want to be around. We're all busy, and we're trying to get out and do these things, and especially in Legion, there's so much to do. So a lot of times we're impatient, and we need to recognize that it's our impatience too. I like to pug. You get mad at me for pugging, but I like to pug because I get out there and get some experience that I wouldn't, not only with the community, but as a healer. Healing you guys is sort of boring because you don't necessarily stand in the fire as much. And I get to practice more. Oh, wow, this guy stood in the fire. And so I like to go do it some days. Other days I get in there and it's just a really bad environment and I go do it later.
Yeah, okay, so we can go back to, the environment piece, and why is it a bad environment, right? Is it because, people are trying to be cool on the internet, right? Is this whole Tide Pods thing, have they been eating too many of those, right? Is that where our communities have been going?
I
I don't know.
guess, and I don't know how that became viral, but anyway, it's I think some of it is because we're anonymous, because we're not looking somebody in their face and seeing who they are. And it's really easy, and there's a good story, and we've told it before, but we had a run where the guy said, "Hold on, let me go get my mom." And we slowed down. And oftentimes I meet some really awesome people in LFR.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets a bad rep, but people tend to go in or can go in because they're on the internet and just be a jerk. And it's something that we're all cognizant of. And I think a lot of it honestly came the cause. What's the cause? Well, it used to be server transfers weren't a thing. And if you were having those kinds of challenges, if you were that kind of a person, you couldn't get invited to a raid. So with LFR and some of those other things, it's contributed to it. But we have to weigh all of the positives that's come from LFR and being able to group up no matter when.
Oh, absolutely. And I've always been of the mindset that LFR has been great for the community, right? It's great to have the convenience to be able to queue up and do, a bit of a raid on your lunch break or have very little time committed to do those things, right? And some of the negatives of that, well, those are sort of self-imposed by us, right? By the community, by players that are ignorant or don't know. Here, Face makes another really good point where she was doing a dungeon or an LFR or something, and somebody was complaining about not being battle resed. Well, they don't realize that, hey, we're saving this battle res for when a tank or healer dies. Sorry, DPS, you're a little bit more expendable than a tank or healer, because if a tank or healer dies, we're going to wipe, right? Rather than just having one more DPS up there so you can be the top of the meters, or, halfway up the meters, right? But again, it's educating people on that ignorance, right? That's how we're going to improve that stuff.
Well, and I think if we go in and let's talk about how do we make it better.
Yep.
Because I think we need to make it better, one step at a time. So when I'm in a dungeon or a raid, and there's a lot of people who have run with me, and I'll
Mm-hmm.
say, we're death testers or we're zeros to heroes, and that's not what we're gonna do. And I think we start with pride in our guild tag.
Absolutely. And that's my philosophy, at least in the last, how many years? 13 years of Death Jesters, 4 years in EverQuest. It was always that pride in your guild tag. Your guild tag is your uniform, right? If people see me acting a certain way, right, well, they're going to generalize the entire guild as players that are like that, which, could be good or bad depending on what kind of reputation you want to build for your guild, right? Have that pride in your guild tag of this is your home, that is your family name, right? That is what represents you, and acting accordingly is really important, right? When you're in these kind of leadership positions, right, you want to choose the groups that you want to associate with, right? Do you want to associate with, the meme lord crowd, or do you want to associate with other people that are like-minded like you, right? There's reasons a lot of guilds have been around for so long and other guilds don't last very long, and part of that is the environments they cultivate, right? I'm a firm believer of, you throw somebody into an environment, right, and they're going to mold into that environment to a certain extent. You're going to sponge up as much information and experience that you can, but you're going to be a product of your environment, right? This whole toxicity thing, I don't believe it's genetic at all. It's us. It's how we are acting. It's what we're used to, right? It's how part of the community acts, and people see that it's okay. And I firmly disagree that that kind of shit is not okay, right? So, what other things can you do? Well, if people are having, let's say discussions, right? Let's go water cooler discussion, right? So Midges and I are chatting. We're having a water cooler discussion of, hey, that fight sucked. We wiped a couple times last night, and then it, sort of evolves into, oh, well, Midges is a terrible raid leader, partly because she's a gnome and she can't see half the people, right? Well,
Absolutely.
is that the kind of discussion
keep
that you want to be
keep
having?
keep spreading that Midgets is a terrible raid leader, because I'm not doing it.
But is that the discussion you want to be having? So if you overhear those things, well, do you put a stop to them? I know it's tough. I know it's a very difficult thing for people to do, to step up and say, "Hey, that's not okay," right? Hey, that kind of language is not okay, and people are afraid, right? And again, it's back to school, it's back to workplace, it's back to environments you're comfortable with. It's not being disliked by your peers, right? Part of that, because again, is the community you want to be in. And we're going to talk about this next week in our discords. Of if you see all that crap happening in the discords, well, why aren't you speaking up? Right? Same thing in guild chats. Like if you see something that is not okay in a guild or a raid chat, why not speak up, right? What's the reason against it, right? And you want to contribute to having some of those really good discussions.
Well, and not only discussions, and sometimes, stepping up is a little more challenging because you end up in a fight that you didn't want to come in. You just wanted to get on and play the game.
I agree. Like,
and so it's not always just that easy. I mean, even within our own guild, and we have a pretty zero tolerance, really cautious of things. But we have, what, 9, 10 different teams.
mm-hmm.
All of those have a different leadership style. And even within your own raid teams, you can have, groups that are back there that don't like that a certain player hasn't been set, or how loot's handling, or all of those things. And instead of having those conversations with the people who can fix it, it's very easy for us to sit in a back channel and complain about it. And where does it go from being just normal human interactions and small groups of people to it being a problem is when it goes from, I don't like this, and we're going to talk to the boss or the raid leader or the guild master, to they're just a jerk, they don't care about us, they're not listening to us, I didn't get my piece of loot, and they're awful. And then it becomes toxic, and then it
mm-hmm.
becomes the bandwagon bitching. And what happens from that is I say, this sucks, and you go, yeah, it sucks, and then the pitchforks and the torches come out, and we go storm the door and take you out. That's the difference.
Yeah, and again, just to reiterate your point, it's okay to have those water cooler discussions. It's okay to have those chats of like, hey, this sucks. Sometimes you need a place to vent. You need a break room, and that's totally okay. It's okay to have those break room discussions. But at some point where it gets toxic, right, where it gets to that point where you're shit talking everybody else, that's where it sort of does need to stop, right? And I know we're touching on both community aspects as well as now guild leadership aspects of it, but part of us as a player base needs to step up to those things, right? Nothing's ever solved by complaining behind the scenes, right? If I have an issue with midgets, I'm not going to go talk to all of our friends about her and the issues I have with midgets. I'm going to say, hey, we have this issue. We need to chat about it, right? It's going directly to that source, right? Be a problem solver, not a problem creator, because by talking to everybody else but midgets, I'm creating more problems, right? And that's sort of what we want you to take away from this. And what?
And it gets back to them. I hate to tell everybody, but most people, if you really want to keep a secret, don't tell anybody. At the end of the day, what you have to remember is it affects your reputation. People notice, they hear about it. Some places, I know Death Jesters do, we check references. Your next team may not want that sort of behavior in their community.
Well, like, listen, I'm here to raid. I don't have time to babysit all these players with their drama issues and everything else. And if you want to start, crapping on people, we don't have time for that. I'm sorry, you're a world-class player, but listen, I don't have time for that. I have neither the patience nor the crayons to deal with your, attention whorism. There's just none of it. So, sorry, right? Like, that's not the kind of environment that we want to cultivate either. And as leaders, decide what kind of environment do you want to cultivate, right? If those players are complaining, to you about somebody else, well, who's to say they won't complain about you to another group of players? Right? Is that the kind of people that you want to have? And, well, let's move on into our leadership lounge section, right? It's, well, how do we cultivate that environment, right? How do we set up success in our own guilds? Well, part of it is clear expectations of what is okay and what is not allowed, right? Go back to a forum, elitist jerks, back in the day, back in their golden age of vanilla, BC, maybe part of Wrath as well. Those forums were so well moderated that no hint of toxicity, poor grammar, nothing was allowed. You were suspended, you were banned, you were done. Right? That was it. Those were their expectations, those were their rules, and they were in force. Right? Well, what else? Right? You want to practice what you preach. So, hey, I'm here doing this podcast. I'm here as a guild leader. Am I going to be, shit talking everybody else here in stream or whatever else? No. And, well, Sparty, what do you mean? Are you perfect? No, and I'm not perfect, right? We're human. We make mistakes, right? And that's fine. And yes, your leadership team, all that stuff, I believe should be held to a higher standard, right? But part of it should be enacting that zero tolerance for, well, I don't want that kind of behavior in my community. Right? As a guild leader, as an officer, what kind of community do you want to build? You're going to let something slide? Well, people are going to see that you let something slide and not other things and seeing favorites, and that's a whole different other issue. Right?
Well, all of this can go to different issues, and none of us are perfect. And sometimes I can think of a few times where I haven't gotten up. The joy of the internet is you have a minute to get up and go get another cup of coffee before you respond. And I can think of a few times that I've read something and I haven't had enough coffee, and I probably haven't come back as tactful as I could have. And so, no, none of us are perfect. And as leaders, we're also put on this impossible pedestal. I laughed because I got clipped because of something I said, and it was so generic. You would have had to have been exactly there. But they clipped it, and they all talked about it. And Midgettes is picking on us. No, and it was really general. Nobody knew about it. But the thing is we're all people. We make mistakes, but the best we can do is talk to each other. And if we look for like minds, I think that's what Zeros to Heroes is. That's how Zeros to Heroes became. That's what so many of your established, you've got people who still come back from 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and say hi, or they come back and play, is because all of these like minds have gathered together.
That's exactly right. You find these like-minded players, and that's how we started this guild 13 years ago now, right? If you build it, they will come, and we wanted to have that same kind of environment, the same kind of people, right? And now it's evolved into more of a community focus, and there's a lot of good communities. This is not just the only community out there, right? The only good one like this, the very positive one. There's plenty of really awesome communities out there, whether they be gnome communities or the CTR community or whatever. There's plenty of really good ones out there, and really, we should not be the minority, but we should be the majority, right? These kinds of communities should be out there for everybody.
Well, and we have to realize, and elitist jerks is a good example. We have to realize that there's always going to be subsects of complaining. So you have to pick your hills and battles. Elitist jerks spent hours moderating those.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah, they were always looking for moderators.
When I came out here, I would have never posted on that forum ever, because they were so harsh and hard. They were. I know you loved, but some of that comes from those vanilla days too. But you got to remember, we can't micromanage everything. You can't see everything, and sometimes you just got to not sweat the small stuff. I think that's a book out there too.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah, listen. They're small things in the grand scheme of life, in the grand scheme of the video game, or your leadership or your team or whatever. Some things are just, you just sort of let them, okay, that's just whatever, right? That's somebody complaining. That's not really too important. That's not something you need to be spending your time on, because really, if you spent your time dealing with everything that somebody said, there wouldn't be enough hours in the day to sleep, let alone play the game, right? But
so what do we do? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, what do we do? Well, you have to encourage people. Part of it is tough, right? And part of it is trying to be that approachable player, or approachable leader, and not being this, this old man that yells from the hilltops, yelling commands, which has been the perspective of myself, unfortunately, for a long time. And that's Sparty the raid leader, but Sparty the guild leader and Sparty the person is a completely different a whole different thing, right? I'm super reasonable and easy to talk to, right? And it's tough to get that across to people, but you need to open that communication. It's a two-way street. You have to encourage people to come to you with problems or concerns, right? And show them, have a good track record of dealing with those issues, of not just, hey, I heard you, but hey, I also listened to you, right? And, maybe we put up some solutions together.
Well, you want to try to touch your people regularly in
What do
your
you mean touch people
guild, on your
regularly?
leadership.
Sorry.
Bad. But the thing is there's only so many hours in a day, and you're playing the game too. So you have to try to balance that. And but the biggest thing I can ever say is when there's a problem, go to the source. I've mentioned it before when we all played telephone, at least we did back in my day. When we were kids, they would play telephone and give you a sentence and then see what the sentence ended up of after 20 or 30 people. And it was completely different than what it started at. And you have to remember that. But I think if there is complaining, or you need to find the source, if it's something that you can fix, why don't you touch on that?
Did you just explain the telephone game for us? I think you're really dating yourself now, having to explain what telephone is to all these kids out there.
Right?
But no, you're right though, right? It's not about telephone and, oh, he said, she said, and I heard this other stuff. And again, that's the whole thing in the realm of toxicity. It's go right to the source rather than letting shit fester and grow of like he said, she said, and I'm gonna assume what's happening here. It comes down to communication, right? My own leadership teams know how much I've been stressing this. Just communicate. Right? Communicate to everybody, anything and everything, right? To the leadership. Let them resolve those issues, right? And, if they don't resolve them, that's a whole different thing. But, go to your leadership and communicate these things, or go to the person directly rather than hearing it from, two other sources that were, two parts removed, right? I mean, hey, sometimes you are the reason why things are going correctly, right? You might be that reason why people are complaining, and you have to have a little bit more, humility than pride and say, oh, it's never me, right? Other things, well, people always say, oh, don't try to make everybody happy. Listen, I always try to make everybody happy, but you have to realize and recognize that that will not be the case. You will not always make everybody happy. I think you should try, and I think you should do your best to make your team, your sports team, your guild, your community happy where possible, but ultimately in that scope of your vision. Hey, so and so, I'd love to, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example now. Here's a good one. I want to do open recruitment for my raid team. Well, that's great. I'd love to make you happy, but that's not in the overall scope of our vision right now. That vision may change, that vision may expand, but at this point, I'm sorry, I can't make you happy, right? And again, you set that vision, you sell people on that vision for your community, and recruit those like-minded people that share that vision as well. You change some things, you're going to have early adopters, some people will jump on the bandwagon, and people that don't, well, they're just the blessed late leavers, as we say. I mean, if people don't share in your philosophies, then maybe they're not right for your community, but they'll be right in a different community, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, and sometimes you have to make those hard decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But what it is, and we'll go back to the gnomes. I think that this is a situation where Blizzard just can't make the gnomes happy because they have not, up to this point, had major lore. They're important throughout their lore. They're interweaved in the lore, but they're not a major lore storyline. Maybe if we go back and get Gnome Reagan, then we will. But until then, it's probably one of those areas where Blizzard said, I'm just not going to make you happy. They've worked towards making people happy about vanilla servers. Those things are going to happen. The only thing I can say about that, though, is I'm going to listen to somebody who comes at me and says, I would really like this. And then when I say, well, I don't think it's the right thing, instead of coming back and going, she just doesn't listen to me, and she doesn't like my ideas, and I can never say anything that she agrees with, to recognize that and hear the other side of the story. Because oftentimes, and if you look at like the Blizzard tweets, they can't say anything that doesn't have pages of just hate.
Mm-hmm. People aren't always going to agree. And, That's it. We need to learn to be adults, and as people grow up and mature, and I'm not saying, the community is immature and, we're dealing with a bunch of 13-year-olds, but as people grow up and you mature, you learn to deal with these things, in life and in work of you can't always get your way, right? And just because somebody doesn't agree with you doesn't mean they're not listening to you.
Well, I think I believe the baby Ashbringer has some very strong thoughts on
I
this.
agree with everything she just said. Absolutely. I mean, it's clearly her bedtime. We're way past it, and she's absolutely right. But I do want to leave off with one really important sort of soapbox segment. And Lore, for those of you who know Lore, Devil Lore, the old CM Lore, still community manager, he touched on a number of really good things, and something that I'm truly passionate about as well, right? The don't feed the trolls mantra, this philosophy, does it actually work? Well, yes and no. And his point was that it's a big, exceedingly common misconception of, yes, you could mute people and block people, and you'll personally stop yourself from seeing that behavior, but it does nothing to prevent that behavior from continuing or seeing others from that behavior from and emulating it, right? So on the one hand, yes, you're here to play a video game. You're not here to change the world and change the community. But at the same time, how much are we contributing to it by not saying anything, right? I get it. Some people want to just play a video game and just want to relax, and you're not here to make the world a better place, right? You're not here for to make world peace, right? Well, part of it is it's an old, the whole don't feed the trolls thing may or may not always work, right? It may work part of the time, but I think in a large percentage of the time, failing to speak out against something, right? Some kind of injustice, whatever it may be, or some kind of toxic behavior, has the same effect as condoning it. And you guys can agree or disagree with me however you want, right? But that's something I feel very passionately about, right? Where something that is said that is not okay, again, has the same effect as condoning it. And yeah, you know what? People are going to say the whole anonymity of the internet has that effect of people, right? You're anonymous, you're on the internet, what you do doesn't matter. And people, it brings out the worst in people, right? But I think that's, again, a small percentage of people that do that, right? And those people are exceedingly few in number compared to those who get caught up in this bandwagon bitching or bandwagon toxicity, thinking that that behavior is acceptable. And we're going to touch on that stuff next week. But it goes back to, well, we're not doing anything about it, right? Well, it's clearly acceptable, even though it's some really crappy things being said. So yeah, Sparty, you can try, right? I'm not here to. So somebody on my Twitter feed, told me a while ago, I'm not here to teach people how to adult, right? Well, that's fair, right? I mean, not everybody wants to teach everyone else how to behave like an adult, and that's okay. My personal philosophy is, well, it behooves us as humanity, as a community, to make it a better place, right? And you mentioned this to me right before the podcast. So, Sparty, you can't have world peace, right? You can't solve the community. I'm sorry, your podcast is not going to solve it today. But you have to start somewhere, right? You have to start local, and every little bit makes a difference. Start small and set that example.
Agreed. And every day, every time we do something good, we're setting that example. And sometimes we fail. Sometimes we make a mistake. But I'd like to believe that most of the people in Warcraft are great people, and it's a very small amount of people. They're just really, really loud.
Well, let's be louder and better and, be more positive than everybody else, right? That's, again, start off in our own little communities or your own guilds and just let it spread like wildfire, because that kind of positivity, that kind of, that good message is infectious and it will spread. But that's good.
Well, what are we going to do next week?
Well, next week, let's finish up part 2 of our little toxicity discussion, the reasons for it, maybe some psychology behind it, and hopefully we'll have Zupercat here next week for a good discussion on her a little bit older essay now on toxicity, on the discourse, that kind of stuff. We'll talk a little bit more about community. That being said, though, our other updates, our buddy birds are doing well. I think we had a couple more dozen buddy birds between our guild and some new people coming into it. For those of you that do have suggestions, ideas, topics, nominations for future buddy birds, I've reached out to a couple people on Twitter that I saw complaining. Well, not really complaining. They were more unhappy for the fact that they don't have, their buddy bird yet. So I've reached out to a few, and hopefully we'll see them in our next couple of buddy birds runs between Death Jesters and Zeros to Heroes. And we'll, obviously have some alpha, beta, PTR coverage for those of you that want to be there for it. But yes, email us, let us know, give us feedback, maybe share some stories about good and bad messages about toxicity. One of our players, Peppers, he's actually he sold himself as a reformed toxic player, and I had a really good sort of interview with him that we'll be sharing next week of how he went from this super toxic high-end PvP player to a non-toxic person that really learned from his mistakes. But that's it for this week. Thank you guys for watching, for listening. We'll see you next week. Have a good one. Be excellent to each other, and as always, live your life heroically.